You see this forest? Isn't it beautiful? Well, the forests that we see today look nothing like the forests of 100 or 150 years ago. Thankfully, panoramic photos were taken in the 1930s from thousands of western mountaintop lookouts, and they show a fair approximation of the forest that we inherited. The best word to describe these forests of old is patchy. The historical forest landscape was this constantly evolving patchwork of open and closed canopy forests of all ages, and there was so much evidence of fire. And most fires were pretty small by today's standards. And it's important to understand that this landscape was open, with meadows and open canopy forests, and it was the grasses of the meadows and in the grassy understories of the open forests that many of the wildfires were carried. There were other forces at work too, shaping this historical patchwork. For example, topography, whether a place faces north or south, or it's on a ridgetop or in a valley bottom. Elevation, how far up the mountain it is, and weather, whether a place gets a lot of snow and rain, sunlight and warmth. These things all worked together to shape the way the forest grew. And the way the forest grew shaped the way fire behaved on the landscape. You can see that in dry forests, trees were open grown and fairly far apart. Fires were frequent here, and when they occurred, they weren't that severe. While further up the mountain, in the moist and the cold forests, trees were more densely grown and fires were less frequent, but when they occurred, they were quite a bit more severe. These different forest types, the environments they grew in, and fire severity, they all worked together to shape this historical patchwork. And there was so much power in this patchwork. It provided a natural mechanism to resist the spread of future fires across the landscape. Once a patch of forest burned, it helped to prevent the flow of fire across the landscape. A way to think about it is that the burned patches helped the rest of the forest to be forest. Let's add humans to the mix. For 10,000 years, Native Americans lived on this landscape, and they intentionally burned it a lot. They used fire to burn meadows and to thin certain forests so they could grow more food. They used fire to increase graze for the deer and the elk and the bison that they hunted. And most importantly, they figured out if they burned in the spring and the fall, they could avoid the out-of-control fires of summer. European settlement, it occurred much later, in the mid-1800s. And by the 1880s, livestock grazing was in high gear. And if you think about it, the cattle and the sheep, they ate the grasses, which had been the conveyor belt for the historical fires. And this prevented once frequent fires from thinning out trees and burning up dead wood. Later came roads and railroads, and they acted as potent fire breaks, interrupting further the flow of fire across this landscape. And then something happened which caused a sudden pivot in our society. In 1910, we had a huge wildfire. It was the size of the state of Connecticut. We called it the Big Burn. It stretched from eastern Washington to western Montana, and it burned in a few days 3 million acres, devoured several towns, and it killed 87 people. Most of them were firefighters. Because of the Big Burn, wildfire became public enemy number one, and this would shape the way that we would think about wildfire in our society for the next 100 years. Thereafter, the Forest Service, just 5 years young at the time, was tasked with the responsibility of putting out all wildfires on 193 million acres of public lands, and they took this responsibility very seriously. They developed this unequaled ability to put fires out, and they put out 95 to 98% of all fires every single year in the US. And from this point on, it was now fire suppression and not wildfires that would become a prime shaper of our forests. After World War II, timber harvesting got going in the West, and the logging removed the large and the old trees, and these were survivors of centuries of wildfires. And the forest filled in, thin-barked, fire-sensitive small trees filled in the gaps. And our forest became dense, with trees so layered and close together that they were touching each other. So fires were unintentionally blocked by roads and railroads. The cattle and sheep ate the grass. Then along comes fire suppression and logging, removing the big trees. And you know what happened? All these factors worked together to allow the forest to fill in, creating what I call the current epidemic of trees. Go figure. More trees than the landscape can support. So when you compare what forests looked like 100 years ago and today, the change is actually remarkable. Notice how the patchwork has filled in. Dry south slopes, they're now covered with trees. A patchwork that was once sculpted by mostly small and sort of medium-sized fires has filled in. Do you see the blanket of trees? After just 150 years, we have a dense carpet of forest. But there's more. Because trees are growing so close together, and because tree species, tree sizes, and ages are so similar across large areas, fires not only move easily from acre to acre, but now so do diseases and insect outbreaks, which are killing or reducing the vitality of really large sections of forest now. And after a century without fire, dead branches and downed trees on the forest floor, they're at powder keg levels. What's more, our summers are getting hotter, and they're getting drier, and they're getting windier. And the fire season is now 40 to 80 days longer each year. Because of this, climatologists are predicting that the area burned since 2000 will double or triple in the next 3 decades. And we're building houses in the middle of this. 2 recently published studies tell us that more than 60% of all new housing starts are being built in this flammable and dangerous mess. So when we do get a fire, large areas can literally go up in smoke. How do you feel now about the forest image that I first showed you? It scares the heck out of me. So what do? We need to restore the power of the patchwork. We need to put the right kind of fire back into the system again. It's how we can resize the severity of many of our future fires. And the silver lining is that we have tools and we have know-how to do this. Let's look at some of the tools. We can use prescribed burning to intentionally thin out trees and burn up dead fuels. We do this to systematically reduce them and keep them reduced. And what is that going to do? It's going to create already burned patches on the landscape that will resist the flow of future fires. We can combine mechanical thinning with some of these treatments where it's appropriate to do so and capture some commercial value and perhaps underwrite some of these treatments, especially around urban areas. And the best news of all is that prescribed burning produces so much less smoke than wildfires do. It's not even close. But there's a hitch. Prescribed burning smoke is currently regulated under air quality rules as an avoidable nuisance. But wildfire smoke, it simply gets a pass. Makes sense, doesn't it? So you know what happens? We do far too little prescribed burning, and we continually eat smoke in the summers from megafires. We all need to work together to get this changed.
Understanding some of the history of fire can lead to a better understanding of the role of fire today.
Tom Swetnam pieces together the history of fires in the laboratory of tree ring research.
We're able to do this by sampling trees that have been scarred by past fires. Trees are excellent recorders of the frequent widespread surface fires that burn through pine forests. What we can do is take samples, cross-section samples like this, from the base of trees that have fire scars on them. And when we look at the tree rings, we can see a very clear and distinct record of fires recorded within the rings. For example, this tree here established in about 1783, and it was scarred the first time in about 1796. And after that point in time, this tree had an open wound that enabled fires to rescar the surface. And we get a sequence of scars, about 6 or 7 scars, recorded on this tree out to about 1899. This is a very typical pattern for pine forests of the western U.S. We see repeated fires are recorded in the tree rings, and then right around the turn of the century, these repeated spreading fires no longer occur. They're no longer recorded on these trees. We believe this is because at this time intensive grazing by sheep and cattle began, and also the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service began to put fires out.
Practically everybody wanted fires put out, but removing or excluding fire from our landscapes has actually increased the risk of large, catastrophic fires. The frequent widespread fires that used to burn across much of America removed much of the fuel or the dead material like the grass, sticks, and logs that inevitably build up over time. In the process, they also limited the growth of the small trees that can overcrowd a forest.
The tragedy in our national history is not that we suppressed wildfires. The tragedy is that we quit lighting controlled fires, because you need to do both. There are always fires you have to control, but there are also occasions where you need to set them.
The effects of excluding fire are shown in several ways, and it really depends on the vegetation community and the habitat you're talking about. But one thing you find over and over is a loss of diversity. If you exclude fire, you're getting a buildup of fuel, a buildup of canopy cover, an expansion of shrubs or trees into grasslands. And so you're losing habitat for animals, you're losing the requirements that plants need to maintain themselves as individual species, and so you lose that diversity. Fire is a process of many, many ecosystems, just the same as the amount of rainfall that occurs or the snowfall, the wind that occurs, the soil type, and the streams that flow through it. So it's a process. Also, if trees are stressed because there's a high density of trees per acre when normally fire would keep it to a lower density, those trees that are alive are stressed and weakened, and they are susceptible to insects and diseases.
I think some of the effects of excluding fire from these systems are many-fold. We could talk about wide-ranging air quality degradations, episodes of smoke impacts from wildfires on multi-state areas, and years of drought are becoming increasingly more frequent. We see the unnatural accumulation of fuels as we've kept fires out and they no longer clean up fuels on the forest floor and various different kinds of ecosystems. We see the increasing threat to people where they live. The fuel threats around wildland-urban interfaces are becoming more serious. Studies have shown that there used to be 23 trees per acre of ponderosa pine in some areas. Recent studies in 1992 have shown that number is now 850 trees per acre. Now you can just get a mental image of 23 trees per acre versus 850, and you can imagine the crown fire potential that exists in those dense and what we call dog hair stands of ponderosa pine today. So when there's a lightning strike, when there's a drought, these fires are extremely difficult to control for the firefighter. They're threats to the firefighter's life and welfare. They're threats to the urban-wildland interface. And there is a better way, and the better way is to reduce the density of those stands in whatever mechanism makes sense before the drought and before the lightning so that the firefighter can be more successful. Fires are a kind of force of nature that it's simply not a matter of if they will occur, but only when. And fires will occur no matter what technology we have in place. It will happen. People will be careless with fire no matter how hard we try and prevent the careless human-caused fire. So there will be fires, and that's why, again, it's so important to follow the caveat of everyone planning for the when of fire occurrence.
There are definitely trade-offs between the smoke emitted from wildfire and the smoke emitted from prescribed fire. When we ignite prescribed fires, we watch the meteorology so that the wind will not blow the smoke towards communities, or we don't burn during times of inversion. We can do a very good job of scheduling our prescribed fires for times when the meteorology is optimum to minimize the impact that smoke has. Well, we cannot do that with wildfire.
A prescribed burn or an intentional burning of vegetation under strict and specific circumstances helps restore and maintain wildlife habitat. A lot of planning goes into deciding where and when we'll perform a prescribed fire, and depending on the amount of fuel that's on the ground, the wind direction, weather parameters, all determine where we're going to burn, as well as our wildlife habitat objectives. So we've got several objectives for our prescribed burn today. First, we're going to try and reduce the amount of fuel on the forest floor, such as pine needles and dead grasses. Second, we're out here to improve wildlife habitat of this open grassland community that we're managing for. And third, we're trying to reinvigorate the native grassland community. We typically conduct our prescribed burns in 2 different seasons. We use drip torches, we use hand rakes, and most importantly, we have water trucks on site. Residue from the burn will be used as a mineral fertilizer for the plants, and as little as 2 weeks after the burn, you can see they've already started to recover. In a relatively short amount of time, the native vegetation has returned. The land has rebounded into an area that provides food and cover for native wildlife.